Hi, this is Larry, the cheapskate woodworker, and this is my homemade router table. Actually, it's not a full-fledged router table, as it's not on a permanent base. As you can see, it sits on top of a pair of sawhorses. My shop area is not that big. It's one bay of a 3-car garage, so a standalone table would take up way too much room. I'll show you how the table is stored away when it's not in use later in this video. The table was designed around a homemade router lift created by John Heisz of iBuildit.ca. You can buy the plan for the lift in either the SAE or metric version from John's website. There's a link to the purchase page in the description below. Also, Jay Bates of Jay's Custom Creations has made a build video for the lift, and there's a link to Jay's video below as well. Now, unlike most homemade router lifts that I've seen plans for, this one is extremely easy to build and can be made mostly from scrap plywood. The only oddball part that you're going to need is a 7/8 inch roller bearing. I found one on eBay for around $7, including shipping. The surface of the table measures 24 inches by 18 inches and is made with 3/4 inch birch plywood and a 3/4 inch piece of MDF laminated together. I then found the position for the hole for the router bit to come through by drawing lines across the two diagonal corners. The center of the table is where the two lines intersect. Next, I placed a V-groove bit in my router and attached the router into the lift. The two laminated pieces were placed bottom side up. The router was lowered to where it was just barely touching the wood, and the lift was then positioned so the tip of the bit touched the intersecting lines. Once I had the lift positioned correctly, making sure that the crank side of the lift was facing toward what would be the front of the table, I marked the position of where the mounting bolts would go using a nail set punch through the mounting holes already drilled in the lift. In this picture you can see the mounting holes circled in red, as well as the point of the V bit aligned right up to my X mark. Once I had done this, I placed the router and the lift aside. Next, I drilled a 2 1/4 inch hole for the router bits to come through in the center of the table using a hole saw. Then 4 1/4 inch holes for mounting the lift were drilled on the punch marks. I flipped the tabletop over so the top side was facing upward and drilled countersinks deep enough for the heads of the 4 carriage bolts to sink down into. Next, I inserted 4 1/4 inch carriage bolts. These are used for attaching the lift to the table. And at this point, I tightened a nut and a washer to the end of each of the carriage bolts so that they would be drawn down into the holes, and to make sure that the countersinks were deep enough so the heads are below the surface. Next, a 3/4 inch wide by 3/8 inch deep slot for the front T-track was cut along the front. Now, by the way, the T-track here is optional. You can skip it if you want to. Then a piece of 1/8 inch thick melamine coated hardboard was laminated to the top. This holds the carriage bolts in place and also is the top surface of the router table that our projects can smoothly slide across the melamine. I cut a 1/4 inch wide slot in the melamine along the center of the 3/4 by 3/8 inch groove, so that I now had a T-track on the front of my table. With the melamine side down, I used the previously drilled 2 1/4 inch hole as a guide for the hole saw to drill a matching hole through the hardboard. I put several pieces of tape on the melamine where the hole saw would come through, so it wouldn't chip too badly when the hole saw finally came through the surface. Next, I laminated another piece of melamine hardboard to a piece of 2x4. This piece becomes our hinge support arm. Lay the tabletop across the sawhorses and then butt its back edge up against the hinge support arm. Attach two hinges as you see here. Now the hinges you see on my table are some I had on hand. They do not have to be as big as you see in the picture. Just piano hinges or smaller hinges, whatever you have will work, just as long as they're sturdy. Now remove the nuts and the washers we used to draw the carriage bolts down into the MDF and attach the lift, with or without the router in place, to the underside of the base using the same nuts and washers. Your lift table is now completely assembled and is almost, notice I said almost, ready for use. Flip the table over so the melamine surface is on top. Clamp the ends of the hinge support arm to a sawhorse to hold everything in place. You can change router bits by lifting the table top up and placing a 2x4 across the sawhorses and under the edge of the lift. As you can see, you have plenty of room for bit changes without removing the router from the lift, which is a big plus to this router lift design. Of course, every good router table needs a good fence. I built mine using Steve Ramsey's adjustable bit opening fence design. The link for Steve's video on the build of this fence is below, and the actual fence build starts about 4 minutes in. Since I do all my sawdust creating activities outside, I've not yet installed a dust collector attachment, and unlike Steve's method of having the face clamps built in, I just used my trusty Irwin clamps to hold the fence in place. I also did not incorporate a T-track across the top of the fence as Steve did. In case you're wondering, the corner braces on the top of my fence keeps everything aligned on the top edge when I'm adjusting the fence width. This keeps the 1/8 inch dust relief slot open where the fence faces meet the tabletop. Now, as I mentioned, due to the small size of my shop, I built this tabletop to be used on sawhorses. When I am finished with the router table, I remove the router from the lift and hang the tabletop on a stretcher board attached across the ends of my lumber rack. And that's how I made my router table. The lift works great and stays accurate throughout its height raising or lowering operations. Being able to store the tabletop up and out of the way is a big plus as well. In the near future, I'll be making a foot switch to turn the router on and off, and I'll make a video of that build as well. So if you want to make a router table with a lift, I strongly recommend John's lift plan. It's well worth the money, and I could not be any more pleased with the way everything turned out. So until next time, this is Larry, the Cheapskate Woodworker. May your sawdust be fine and your splinters be few.